I'm going to give the midterm prep sheet out at the end of the class, just to ensure that you're fully focused on the amazing lecture I'm about to give you. Does anyone know who that band was? It was English, I promise you. It was a band called The Strange Death of Liberal England, which just goes to show that so many pop bands in Britain have a very solid and profound historical training. Dreadful video, but great name for a band. Okay, so my last two lectures have been about the sort of fundamental economic and social challenges that faced liberalism in the last quarter of the 19th century. And essentially this week, my lectures are about a new and different set of challenges that liberalism faces in the early 20th century. Primarily, I'm going to talk today about a set of political challenges, both in Britain and across the British Empire. And then on Thursday, I'm going to look at the great trauma, militarily, economically, politically, and culturally, that was the First World War. And so the abiding image that I want you to have for this lecture today is the one on the slide behind me, which, of course, you should all be able to recognize as the great ship, the Titanic. Okay, the largest ship ever built in the world, a sign of Britain's preeminent merchant navy. And yet, as we all know, because I'm sure many of you have seen the movie, it sinks on its first journey. So I'm going to suggest to you today, and you were so good last week, and I'm going to suggest to you today that in many ways Britain is rather like the Titanic in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Rebecca, it's like a disease. You're all coming in late. Most especially that the liberalism that Britain had become associated with was like the Titanic. That is to say that some of its central ideas, the ideas of a free trade empire, of the essential racial superiority of the British, of a non-interventionist state, of the rule of law, and of the question of who should be politically represented, all of these central tenets of liberalism are fundamentally challenged in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. So this is now the other introduction to the lecture. You see before you 2 images of the funerals of the most impressive and sort of gigantic figures on the political stage in Britain in the 19th century. William Gladstone, who dies in 1898, had been Prime Minister 4 times, had been Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times, had been in and out of government ministries since the Peel administration of the 1840s. His political career basically spanned being at the very top of British government for half a century. The other is, of course, the death of Queen Victoria, who had been Queen since 1937. Okay, so many people felt that these 2 deaths really did represent the end of an era, the end of a sort of golden era of Britain's liberal progress in the 19th century. I'm going to suggest that they usher in a 20th century that is, I hate this phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway, is deeply conflicted. That is to say, on the one hand, it's Britain in the 20th century is characterized by a certain complacent optimism, that this golden age is just going to continue, this great prosperity, Britain's imperial supremacy, its racial superiority will march on unchecked. And in a way, the poem that you've all read by Kipling, The White Man's Burden, is the perfect demonstration of that complacence and sense of the innate superiority, continuing superiority of the British. There is, however, as you know from last week, underneath this, a growing set of anxieties and fears that Britain is becoming increasingly unable to fulfill Kipling's White Man's Burden, an anxiety that gathers force, as you'll see today, by a belief that the empire can only be maintained by force, that poverty and racial degeneration was spreading at home, and there was growing political instability across the empire in the forms of colonial nationalism in Ireland and India especially, the rise of the labour movement and the suffrage movement in Britain itself. Now, the classic account of this end of an era was written by an American, George Dangerfield's The Strange Death of Liberal England, which was published in 1936. And in this book, Dangerfield laments, he does lament, but he charts primarily the slow collapse of the Liberal Party, that Gladstone had built up in the second half of the 19th century. And Dangerfield argued that although the Liberal Party tried to reinvent itself to face all of these new challenges in the first decade of the 20th century, it was unable basically to do so, and that the Great War represented the final nail in the coffin of this party. In a sense, I don't think any historian has really significantly advanced that interpretation. However, I'm going to suggest to you that we can broaden it out to think not just of the crisis of the Liberal Party, of the political party known as the Liberal Party, but of liberalism as a philosophy and mentality of government. The very thing that I've been boring you to tears for the past month in trying to explain what it was and how it worked and how it is full of contradictions. I'm going to suggest it's this that is irrevocably shattered in this period of time. Okay, so I'm going to move into this first section of the lecture where I'm going to talk about the possible end of a liberal vision of the empire. Okay? And I'm going to do so under the headings that you see before you. Okay? So I'm not going to show you this slide again and again, but basically they're going to be 4 sections to this part of the lecture. And I'll start by simply remarking through this map of the phenomenal growth in the size of the British Empire that accelerates from the 1870s with the so-called scramble for Africa, where European powers, the French, the German, the Belgians, the British, scramble for territorial claims upon different parts of the continent of Africa. So, for the British, they focus on North, East and Central Africa. Kenya is formally annexed in 1880, Egypt in 1882, Somaliland in 1884, Nigeria in 1886, Rhodesia in 1889. You don't need to get all of this, you just need to get the sense. Sudan in 1899 and Uganda in 1890. As you can see, basically 2.5 million square miles in the period from 1885 through to 1896. But it's not just that the territorial extent of the empire is considerably expanded. It's also that the question of empire becomes increasingly influential in British politics itself. And the first sign of that, in many ways, was Gladstone's attempt to introduce Home Rule for Ireland. Okay? And Gladstone had an attempt, basically from the 1870s onwards, to create a more moralized vision of Britain's role in the world, okay, which had much less to do with formal political control of territories and much more in the sort of Cobdenite tradition of the civilizing influence through free trade. Okay? So Home Rule for Ireland was one of the great test cases for Gladstone. He introduces a bill for the Home Rule of Ireland in 1886, and it fundamentally splits his party. The party that he built is split almost in half. There are 93 Liberal MPs who basically vote against Home Rule for Ireland, and they are led by a person who is going to be increasingly important, the figure of Joseph Chamberlain. Okay? Joseph Chamberlain then leads a breakaway group of so-called liberal unionists. Unionists because they want to maintain the Act of Union with the island of Ireland. Okay? They want to maintain the integrity of the United Kingdom, which included Ireland. Chamberlain, who had made his name in the 1870s in developing something known as municipal socialism, that is, as a governor of the city of Birmingham, developing public utilities works to try and improve the social conditions of the people of Birmingham. That is to say, he was in many ways on the left of the Liberal Party, if that's something that makes sense. Okay? But the maintenance of empire was a critical component to his politics, and it becomes increasingly more so. By the 1880s, he's switching over to become a Conservative MP. He embraces basically the Disraelian tradition of social reform at home and imperialism abroad. And for Chamberlain, increasingly, that meant abandoning free trade, abandoning the so-called empire of free trade, and arguing instead that the empire could become, if you like, an internal trading bloc for the British economy. Okay? That it was going to be carved out as its own economic zone by the introduction of protectionist tariffs. You'll remember that all of Britain's main economic competitors had been reintroducing protection from the 1870s, and Chamberlain argued this had to be done to protect the jobs of British workers at home. Now, this idea of the empire as its own trading bloc was going to become very, very important in the 20th century. But it's first articulated by Chamberlain in the end of the 19th century, and in 1903 he comes out and formally declares his support for this protectionist staff through the introduction of something known as imperial tariffs, okay, arguing for the introduction of